to our esteemed panel of judges. Connecticut, good luck.
Good morning, Connecticut. How's everyone doing today?
Good.
Good. Well, how are you?
Excellent. We're doing good. We're glad to be with you today. Congrats on being able to join us for the national challenge. We will introduce ourselves. You'll introduce yourselves, and then we'll get to the question today. So, my name is Jocelyn Broman. I'm a We the People alumnus. I competed back in 2006. And I currently work on Capitol Hill for Representative Paul Cook of California.
And I'm Francine Engel. I'm from the state of Maryland. I'm a political scientist and constitutional scholar. I work with the Maryland Council for Civic and History Education and teach part-time University of Maryland.
And I'm Mike Miles from Birmingham, Alabama. I'm the county treasurer of Jefferson County, which is Birmingham and 36 other cities, 30 of which owe me money this morning. So I hope Suzanne, it's always a pleasure to see your class. Thank you all for doing this today. Very, very
Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. We are Unit 4. I'm Lars Juva.
I'm Lucy Belknap.
I'm Natalia Medik.
I'm Surya Balaji, and this is our teacher, Mrs. Cameron. Thank you for spending time with us here today.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. It is question 3, Unit 4. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution provides that state legislatures can determine the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives. Yet it gives Congress the power to make or alter such regulations. What are the advantages and disadvantages of a uniform election process? What responsibility do state legislatures, state election officials, and citizens have in maintaining free and fair elections? And finally, what are the advantages and disadvantages of the trustee and delegate theories of representation as they apply to congressional districts? Please begin when ready.
With the coronavirus outbreak bringing life to a standstill, the 2020 election is likely the last thing on Americans' minds. However, this crisis could be the greatest threat to the election's legitimacy in Americans' history. As MIT election expert Charles Stewart put it, has the potential to put Florida 2000 to shame.
Our decentralized system exacerbates the logistics of an election mid-pandemic. Regardless, it's essential that all Americans can and do exercise their right to vote in order to maintain free and fair elections.
Moreover, citizens must be informed. As Thomas Jefferson proclaimed, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free in the state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be. Citizens also act as election observers, looking for ways to improve elections and prevent corruption.
State legislatures secure electoral validity through policymaking and oversight of election administrators. They establish district lines, which enables partisan gerrymandering, undermining accurate representation. State election officials administer legislative policies to ensure the election's efficacy. They also handle voter registration, appoint local officials, and execute federal election requirements like the National Voter Registration Act and the Help America Vote Acts.
However, some argue interstate disparities in resources, processes, and regulations lead to uneven results. Such flaws were illuminated during the 2000 presidential election, in which poorly designed ballots and inconsistent practices compromise the validity of the outcome. A uniform election process would prevent these mistakes.
It would also prevent inconsistent voting requirements across state lines. For instance, UC San Diego found that strict ID laws doubled the turnout gap between whites and Latinos in general elections compared to states without. A uniform system would make the electorate more consistent throughout the nation, giving every citizen equal access to the polls.
However, a uniform system would be vulnerable to interference. Special counsel Robert Mueller's report on the 2016 election alleged that Russian operatives hacked one private election vendor and were able to reach 8 key states. The centralized nature of the vendor's platform enabled this wide-scale attack. A uniform system could leave the U.S. susceptible to mass interference.
A uniform system could also erode trust between state and federal governments. As Hamilton describes in Federalist 59, Article 1, Section 4, assigned regulation of federal elections first to the state legislatures, but permitted federal intervention in only extraordinary circumstances. A uniform system, however, could threaten state power, allowing, as anti-federalist leader Melancton Smith wrote, the ability to manipulate elections to benefit some favorite class to the exclusion of others. For instance, if the federal system included strict voter ID laws, states would be defenseless to protect minority votes.
Accurately representing the whims of constituents necessitates adopting representative philosophies that go beyond the polls. Either a delegate model wherein House members directly voice their constituents' interests, or a trustee system where voters trust representatives to make decisions for the common good of the country.
Some contend the delegate model forces representatives to consider the wide range of values and interests of their constituents. Conversely, the trustee system assumes that what's best for constituents can be determined objectively, when in fact a representative's decision is often heavily influenced by their own political agenda and lobbying efforts. For instance, North Carolina Congressman Richard Burr has battled to eradicate gun regulation in his moderate state after receiving over $6.5 million NRA dollars.
However, the delegate model can, as Stanford professor Kenneth Schott states, lead representatives into the delegate trap of catering to public opinion, even when doing so is not in the nation's best interest. For instance, a congressman representing a mining-reliant community might vote against climate regulations that would ultimately benefit their constituents in order to secure their re-election.
With the election quickly approaching, it's clear that inconsistent practices could lead to chaos rivaling Florida's handling of the 2000 election. Voters face obstacles ranging from a complicated emergency mail-in voting mandate in New York to a reckless continuation of in-person voting in Wisconsin. Either way, it's now more essential than ever to ensure that voting, the foundation of our democracy, is secured. Thank you. We're now ready for questioning.
Excellent. You guys talked about in your statement the differences between state legislatures and what state election officials do. Which is ultimately more important in providing for free and fair elections? The state legislatures creating the state election law or the state election officials administering the law?
I believe that the state legislature plays a more important role in securing the free and fair elections because they ultimately create policies and election administrators simply follow through with those policies. So if the policies are discriminatory in nature, then the election administrators will also follow through with these discriminatory policies. And ultimately, election administrators don't have the ability to act in ways that reduce this discrimination.
Right, so there's instances in which state election officials are almost powerless to affect change. So with, say, partisan gerrymandering on the state level, which is, although it was ruled constitutional in Rucho v. Common Cause, it still may lead to unfair districts which swing the advantage in favor of one specific party over another. And that's purely at the discretion of state legislatures.
Do you feel that there are any groups that are still disenfranchised? And if so, what is causing them to be disenfranchised?
I believe that non-citizens should have the right to vote in addition to citizens because a lot of non-citizens are just as impacted by the legislation that results from an election as citizens. So for instance, a family of non-citizens living in a certain area are affected in the same way as citizens because their kids might be going to the public schools and they're paying taxes because they're working. So the fact that they're impacted by this legislation but they can't have a say in it is something that should change.
Another disenfranchised group is third-party voters, and this is due to the clear overtaking of power by the Democratic and Republican Party. If you're a third-party voter, you must register in a caucus if you want to vote in one of the two major parties, even if you don't agree with their belief systems. And even if you look into Congress, with the unique example of Bernie Sanders, almost every single person is either a Democrat or Republican. And to achieve any real power and make any real change in the nation, you must associate with one of these powerful parties because they work together as a group to pass votes through. So they're most definitely a disenfranchised group in our nation.
In addition, ex-felons are disenfranchised in many states within our country. I believe that once felons serve their sentence and commit or finish their parole, they have as much as a right as any other person within our country to express their political views through voting. And by removing that for them, we're extending their punishment endlessly and punishing them politically, even though they still deserve rights. But nevertheless, the Supreme Court has ruled in Richardson v. Ramirez that the disenfranchisement of ex-felons is constitutional.
And so much of this question focuses on congressional districts. And because there's been so much cracking and packing where the November election night ends pretty early, except for president and 2 or 3 Senate races. Most of the fights now are in the primaries. And the courts have been very loath to involve themselves in partisan primaries. And so secretaries of states and probate judges are just kind of running amok. What would it take? What standard would you have to reach? What abuse would have to occur before you as a judge would feel that it was time for you to get involved and say, no, you're going too far in influencing, using your power as Secretary of State, using your power as the probate judge to influence the outcome of the election?
So there have been many studies on the efficiency gap in gerrymandered districts. So in theory, it's the difference between what the expected vote differences are between both parties and what they actually are in districts. So statistics like that could be used to show how the election is not as competitive as it should be and provide clear, unbiased, unpartisan evidence that could be used in a case like that.
I believe that there's already evidence that suggests very strongly that partisan gerrymandering negatively, in fact, impacts the representation of Congress. And so the court's inability to act on partisan gerrymandering as of yet is in my belief a constitutional crisis that doesn't accurately represent the foundations of democracy that our country was built upon.
So how should state legislatures be drawing their districts? What criteria should they be using and when they draw them?
I think the best way to approach redrawing districts is by using independent redistricting commissions, which were deemed constitutional by the Supreme Court in Arizona State Legislature v. Arizona Independent Redistricting Commission. This process would remove partisan politics from the process of gaining the equality of each vote, which should be a nonpartisan process.
Yeah, we'll
That's
just
tough.
the one for one vote.
Say, Chris, I'll buy that card from you if you'll sell it to me for a few minutes.
Nice job, Connecticut. Nice job.
Say,
Yeah, great job, guys. You led us through a lot of stuff in your statements. And that a lot, like, we haven't, I wish we had done more, I wish we had more time. But the state legislatures versus the state election officials, and that, like, difference of how do we deal with that is, your explanation was good, and explaining it in your statement was good, and then the follow-up of which is more important, that was helpful to just show that your thought process through the entire thing. Yeah, and then also for bringing up independent redistricting commissions as well. When states have adopted that, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And also, if I had had more time, I would have started asking the question of, like, well, what criteria did they use? Is it population? Is it neighborhoods? Do we have to consider having a minority-majority districts to make sure there's representation of different groups? So the next follow-up would be from independent districts, like, what is the next criteria that we consider when we're drawing these congressional districts? So a great job in how you were talking about it and your reasoning throughout. So it's great to hear. I think that's the first time we've heard efficiency gap as well. So good job on that also.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that Jocelyn was saying. What I really thought was kind of fun is, we have this historical question, and just from your very first sentence from the get-go, you brought it into a contemporary issue, because you immediately started talking about COVID and the 2020 election, how it's going to impact that. So I liked, from the very beginning, how we have this historical question, and you brought it up to date, right from the beginning. Good discussion of some Supreme Court cases in your follow-up, which I enjoyed. I enjoyed the discussion of gerrymandering. I wish we had a little bit more time to go through that. You talk about having it redrawn with independent commissions to redraw the lines, which is a great idea. But then, like, how do we pick those people? How do we actually make sure that those people that we're picking are not partisan? Why are they going to be less partisan than anybody else? So it was a great discussion. I just wish we had a little bit more time.
Boy, me too. I agree. You had me from the quote from Thomas Jefferson. I love that quote. You had me from that point on. I'm one of the ones that's been asking questions for 2 days about the state by state efforts to discriminate against groups of voters and use that power to unfairly control the outcome of the election. But you made a very powerful argument for the risk of centralizing control over it. Once somebody hacks into a centralized system, well, we've seen what happened.
Yeah.
But that's something that I needed to hear. You were exactly right. That was a great point, and I love that. I appreciated the parties being discriminated against because of that. I would love to get a copy of your essay. I would like to just sit in a quiet room sometime and read it all the way through, because I think you said some things, as Francine said, you said some things in a different way. We're hearing 15 groups in 2 days, and this is the 13th group, and you said some things differently from any of the other 12 that we've heard so far, in a way where you changed what questions we asked because of how you said what you said. Suzanne, let me tell you, this would have been a great performance if all 5 of you were in one room working together, moving your hands back and forth on the table and all of that. It would have been a great performance. To think the 5 of you are in different places and the 4 of us are in different places, and that this was, as I was about to say, as much like, Chris, like a normal hearing would have been, but this may have even gone beyond that because of the degree of difficulty. In my opinion, this was a brilliant performance this morning. Thank you, and thank you to each of them very much.
Thank you very much for your time this morning.